Hello lovelies, in this video the brilliant Dr. Birds is going through food webs and interdependence for your GCSE biology. Now the really important things you need to take into account here are the arrows, the different levels and how everything interacts with each other.
Organisation of an ecosystem. So we need to be able to understand the different levels of an ecosystem and think about what we mean when we look at these key terms. So here I have one bird. That bird is an example of an organism. Then we have a population of the birds. So this is a group of individuals of the same species in a habitat or area. Then we have a community. So you can clearly see a food web here because there's lots of different food chains all interacting. So a community is all of the populations in an area. So we have a population of rabbits, a population of worms, a population of snails, a population of birds, a population of snakes, a population of lizards, and a population of hawks or eagles. All of those together are interacting because of their food webs. And so this is going to be all in one area. All the different populations of the species make up a community. Then, as we've been saying, in an area or habitat, the habitat is the non-living physical area in which all of these animals and organisms and plants are living. If you think about scaling that up again to a whole ecosystem, this could be as small as something like one single oak tree could be an ecosystem, or it could be as big as the entire planet. An ecosystem is where the communities are interacting with their habitats. So some examples of kind of big scale communities or ecosystems are things like coral reefs and rainforests, where we've got a lot of species interacting with quite a specific environment. So a coral reef is quite unique, for example, but that's all the habitat, the actual kind of hard parts of the reef itself. And then you've got all of those different species living and depending on each other in that area of the coral reef. And so that is an ecosystem. So we need to be able to define these terms and also to be able to recognise these terms and use them correctly in our explanations. So as we said, an ecosystem is made up of different populations of organisms that interact with each other, so the communities that interact with each other. Food chain, so this is just a simple food chain here, not a food web, but each food chain shows simple lines of energy transfer between organisms, and then food webs show where the food chains overlap. So you can see my arrows here represent the transfer of energy between organisms, and we're always going to start with the sun. Even if the sun isn't pictured in any of these food chains that you get as our examples in the exam, just know that obviously, because plants make their own food using light energy from the sun, they harness that energy as producers and they create organic molecules through photosynthesis. So that's how they get their energy to produce those carbohydrates, proteins, lipids through photosynthesis. And this is what creates their biomass. So what we mean by biomass is they've taken those molecules that they've made using photosynthesis in plants, for example. They're taking those carbohydrates, lipids, proteins, and they're using it to build tissues, to build living material. So that's how they grow, by building new cells. Once that energy that they took from the light energy is made into molecules, and then that's used to build tissues and stored in living material, the energy is stored in the biomass. And then the rest of the energy transfers can be thought of as a biomass transfer because the chemical energy is in the living material. So when the rabbit eats the grass, it gets chemical energy from the biomass of the grass, which it then uses, it breaks it down and it produces those new molecules again, the carbohydrates, the lipids, the proteins, and it will do stuff like respire with those carbohydrates, which will provide energy for the rabbit, and also it will make new molecules in order for it to grow out of those molecules. And again, the snake eats the rabbit. It will consume its biomass, it will break it down, it will use the carbohydrates, the lipids, the proteins that it gets from the rabbit to do some respiration, to provide it with energy, but also so that it can create its own new molecules to build its own new cells and grow as well, and so on. So outside of this food chain, we have the decomposers, so the bacteria and the fungi. And the decomposers are responsible for breaking down any of this biomass that comes to them when animals and organisms die or when they produce waste products. And they break all these nutrients down, and that's what the bacteria and the fungi use to get their energy. So they dissolve and break down some of that biomass and absorb some of those nutrients for themselves. But also in that process, they're helping to return those nutrients back to the ecosystem or back to the habitat. So I'm going to start looking at food chains, trophic levels, food webs, and interdependence. So here you can see my simple food chain. I have the sun, I have some grass that's being eaten by a rabbit, that's being eaten by a snake, that's being eaten by an eagle. So we start with the sun. The sun is the source of all energy, both light energy and heat energy on Earth. Without it, we wouldn't have any food chains, we wouldn't have any organisms. Then we go to the producers. All food chains start with a plant. Plants are known as producers because they produce their own nutrients using the energy they get from the sun through photosynthesis. So they are producers. All plants are producers because they produce their own nutrients through photosynthesis. Now we come to the rabbit, which is eating our grass. The rabbit is the primary consumer. It's the first consumer. That's what we mean by primary here. So it's the first consumer in our food chain. It's a consumer because it has to eat other organisms in order to get nutrients. It can't make nutrients on its own like the plant. It is having to eat other organisms, in this case the grass, to get nutrients. The rabbit is also eating only plants. And so in this case, the rabbit can also be called a herbivore because it is only consuming plants. The rabbit, if you look above to the next part of the food chain, is being eaten by the snake. This means that because it's being eaten by another organism and it is an animal, it is also a prey species. So now we have the snake. The snake is the secondary consumer, as in the word second is in there, so it's the second consumer in the food chain. And because it's consuming the rabbit, it's getting its nutrients from eating other organisms. It is also, you'll notice, they're eaten by the eagle. So as well as being a consumer, and because it consumes meat, it is a carnivore this time because it eats only meat and nothing else, but it is also being eaten by the eagle. So it's being a consumer, it's the secondary consumer, it's a carnivore, but because it's being caught and eaten by the eagle, it can also be an example of a prey species as well. Also really important to note here that we've mentioned prey a couple of times now. The secondary consumer can be a prey, the primary consumer can also be prey. The one thing that can never be prey are plants. Plants are producers, they are not prey. They cannot be caught and eaten by other animals. They are just plants, they are just eaten, they are producers, so they can never be described as prey. So don't get confused. Finally, then we have our tertiary consumer, which is our eagle, which is eating the snake. So tertiary in this case meaning third, so it's the third consumer in the food chain. It is the tertiary consumer in the food chain, and it is eating the snake. Nothing is eating the eagle, so we are considering it a top or an apex predator. Nothing eats it, it's not being eaten, so it cannot be prey. It is just a predator, and again, it's also a carnivore because it eats meat. So the eagle is a tertiary consumer, the third consumer in the food chain. It eats the snake, it eats meat, so it's a carnivore, and it is not prey. It is the top or the apex predator, which means it does not have any predators itself. So you'll see part of our food chain now, but this time it's been incorporated into a food web. So a food web is a network of interconnected food chains. So food chains are often just a snapshot of part of a food web because in reality, most plant species will have lots of different animal species that eat it, and most prey species will have lots of different predators. It isn't the case that there is only one for each. So our food chain is highlighted in pink there. You can see the grass, rabbit, snake, eagle. Then we also have grass, worm, bird, snake as another food chain. We have grass, snail, bird, eagle. And we also have grass, snail, lizard, eagle. So that's just 1, 2, 3, 4 food chains in there that we can identify from this one food web. But there's some other connections and branches as well. Now, the other thing you have to be able to do with food webs is to be able to pick out those levels of the food chain. So identify carnivores, herbivores, predators, prey, and tertiary, secondary, and primary consumers and producers. So producers are easy, they're at the bottom of the food chain. So our producer here is the grass. Now we have to be able to identify the primary consumers in our food chain. So that's easy because that's everything that is eating the grass. So we've got snails, worms, rabbits. The bird also eats the grass, but it isn't a primary consumer necessarily because it's actually also playing the role of a secondary consumer. So the secondary consumers would be the lizard, because that's eating another animal, which is the snail. The bird, because that's eating a primary consumer, which is the snail. The bird again, because it's eating the primary consumer, which is the worm. And we've got the snake, which is eating the primary consumer, which is the rabbit. And now we have a look at our tertiary consumer. So we've got our bird, and because that has got two levels below it, a primary and a secondary, so our eagle, which is our tertiary, and we also have the snake. So the snake can also be a tertiary consumer, because if you look at the food chain, snail, bird, snake, it is a tertiary consumer there. So it is a secondary consumer in the food chain with the rabbit, but it is also a tertiary consumer. So we have two tertiary consumers here. We've got the eagle and the snake. And you'll notice I've coded them for you. So the little codes with 1 and a superscript kind of 0 degree sign at the top is code for primary, 2 with a little 0 is secondary, 3 with a little 0 is tertiary. But make sure in your exam that you actually write down the full word and don't use the little symbol, but I've used it here shorthand for you. Okay, so interdependence is one of those big words that is in this topic that we need to be able to understand. There is a clue in the name. Inter, so interactions, and dependence, depending on each other for things. So interdependence is describing how different species within a community, so that food web there demonstrates a community because there's lots of different species, the rabbit, the snail, the worm, the snake, they're all different species. They're all living in the same kind of area. It's describing how they depend on one another to survive. So although obviously some of them are being eaten by other organisms, they are dependent on each other for things like food, and also this is including animals and plants, not just animals. So on the right hand side we've got some examples. So the clownfish here living in his anemone, he is relying on that anemone for shelter. So he is dependent on that anemone because he lives in it and he depends on it for shelter. The plant is reliant on the bee and other insects for sexual reproduction, so pollination, but also other tree species and other plant species are relying on animals for dispersing their seeds. And then we have something as simple as the snail being food for the lizard. So the lizard is dependent on the snail for food. These are examples of interdependencies where one organism is dependent or reliant on the other for their survival. It can be as simple as just being, we need them as food to eat. It can be more complicated like pollination and reproduction and seed dispersal. It can be for shelter, living in a tree. You need to live in the tree. There's a specific relationship between predators and prey though. So predators and prey really do rely on each other, and the numbers of predators and prey can be changed quite drastically if one of the two are affected. So for example, if the numbers of prey decrease, then the numbers of the predator will also decrease because there will be less food for that predator. So less of them will survive and reproduce. Same for the opposite way around. If a load of predators died, then the prey would be specifically less likely to be eaten because there's fewer predators, so the prey species will often increase. So we've got some examples from our food chain. So the first example is quite an easy one because there's not many interactions. So if the number of rabbits were to drastically decrease because they got some kind of disease, then there would be less food for the snakes. So the snake population is likely to also decrease. Another example, this one's a little bit more complicated. If the number of birds were to decrease, again, suddenly because of disease, they all got sick and died. If the number of birds were to decrease, the first thing we could say it could have an impact on is that the number of snails and the number of worms would be likely to increase because there's less predators to eat them, so fewer of them will be dying, and therefore more of them will survive and reproduce, and so the number of snails and worms would increase. But we also have to think about looking up in the food chain above the organism that's been affected and start thinking about predators as well. So we could simply say, oh, well, the eagle will have less food, so it will decrease like we did with the snakes. But that's not accurate here, because actually the eagle doesn't just eat birds according to our food chain. So what we can actually think about saying is that the number of lizards and snakes is likely to decrease, because the eagle is going to have to eat more lizards and more snakes to replace the fact that one of their prey species, the birds, has decreased. So although they're in the same level as the birds, then the eagle, we're saying the eagle's been affected because it's got fewer things to eat. So that means that eagle's going to have to eat more of its other prey species. So it's going to have to eat more lizards and more snakes. So the number of those will decrease. It's also likely the number of snakes is going to decrease a lot, because they also rely on eating birds. So you can kind of see how this spirals out into different layers of the food chain. But the main idea is to be able to look below, what effect would it have on the organisms that that animal eats, but also look up and think about what effect that's going to have on predators and their prey as well. So if a community is considered stable, it's because all of these factors, all of these interdependencies are stable. They don't change much. So their populations don't change much. Their population numbers don't change because the numbers of predators and prey don't change, because everyone is reliant on everyone else, but the system isn't working as it should. And so these communities are often very old or have been around for a really long time. They've been stable for a long time. And one of the examples of those is coral reefs. And so you can use coral reef as an example of a stable community where these big changes in predators and prey don't really change much, because everything is stable and all of their interdependencies work.
Ouch! This is why in some videos I'll explain scratches.